Across America, BP supports more than 275,000 jobs to keep energy flowing. Jobs like expanding capacity for biodiesel in Washington state and reducing operational emissions in the Gulf of Mexico. It's and, not or. See what doing both means for energy nationwide at bp.com/investing in America.
Have you heard? You can listen to your gripping investigations ad-free. Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app or visit amazon.com/truecrime ad-free. That's amazon.com/truecrime ad-free. And catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Content warning, this episode contains discussion of murder, including the murder of children, as well as sexual violence.
Julia Cowley has had the sort of career many of us might dream about. Growing up fascinated with true crime, she eventually joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where she was selected to join the Behavioral Analysis Unit. While a part of that team, she became the lead FBI profiler on the Golden State Killer case.
Now retired from the Bureau, she hosts The Consult, a terrific true crime podcast where she and other retired FBI profilers share their insights on a variety of cases.
We highly recommend The Consult, and we'll link to it in our show notes.
We were excited recently to get a chance to talk with Julia, and we asked her about her work in the Golden State Killer case, the part that criminal profiling plays in investigating cases, and the role the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit is said to have played in the Delphi case. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases.
We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is a conversation with former FBI profiler Julia Cowley about Delphi, criminal profiling, and the Golden State Killer.
I guess to start out, Julia, thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to sort of start out by talking about your background with the FBI. We saw one of your tweets. You mentioned that you joined, partly because of this early love of true crime. Can you just sort of talk us through that and then how you kind of came to become an FBI agent?
Sure. I was fascinated from true crime from a young age. My mother was reading Helter Skelter, and she had told me I wasn't allowed to read it. And then I took it from her anyway and read it. And then I was hooked after reading that. And then I would go to the bookstore and libraries and sit there and look through all the books and pick out the one I wanted to read next. And pretty soon I had read every book on the shelf. And I just knew that I wanted to somehow go into law enforcement, help solve murders. And then, I was good in science and chemistry, so I majored in chemistry in college, and I became a forensic scientist first, and I worked in a crime lab. I was a toxicologist, and then part of my assignment, I was a member of the violent crime response team. This was with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. And so I would go to homicide scenes and process scenes, and then, after being at TBI, one of my colleagues, and somebody who was a mentor to me, he applied to the FBI and joined the FBI. And I decided that that was what I wanted to do. I felt as a forensic scientist, which I really loved forensics and I loved going out to the crime scenes. But I felt like I was one small part of an investigation and I wanted to run my own investigations. And I thought I would have a better opportunity to do that in the FBI. And they were looking for women in science at the time, even back then. And so I applied and was selected. And that's how I got into the FBI. And I was able to kind of continue my forensics career. I became a member of the FBI's evidence response team, but was assigned mostly to white collar through my first years. But what I found out, I kind of knew I really wanted to go into the behavioral analysis unit. And I was worried, because I wasn't investigating violent crime as a regular agent, that I wouldn't have an opportunity. And so I called someone at the unit and I said, what kind of experience do I need? And he told me something that I tell everybody: all you need to do is be a good investigator. It doesn't really matter what your background is. Once you get here, you'll get training. And he thought I had enough violent crime experience from my work being on crime scene teams. So I stuck with public corruption and civil rights, and I loved working it. And then, after doing that for about 11 years, I applied to the BAU, the Behavioral Analysis Unit, and was fortunate enough to be selected. And I can kind of explain too. I was selected, and I applied to the Behavioral Analysis Unit, which was the Crimes Against Adults unit. And they're split up into different sections, which may be relevant to what we're going to talk about today. That may help people understand how BAU is utilized in investigations. But everybody there, they have different specialties.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So the BAUs are under the umbrella of the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, which is under the umbrella of the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group. And there's many different divisions of the FBI and all these little subsections, and it is massive. So the NCABC houses the BAUs and VICAP. And VICAP, they do analysis of crimes and linkage, and they look at, different, they track violent crime cases and correlate them. And they typically focus on murder and or sexual assault. What else? Missing persons, kidnappings, things like that. And it's really, they're crime analysts in that unit. And so that's part of the NCABC. And then the rest of the NCABC are the BAUs. And it's expanded. There are 5 units now. The first unit is BAU 1, and it is terrorism and threats. And they work both international and domestic terrorism. BAU 2 is the cyber unit. So they're looking at cyber criminals and their behaviors. BAU 3 is crimes against children. BAU 4 is crimes against adults, which was the unit that I was part of. And then the 5th unit is a research unit. So that is the entire NCABC.
I wanted to ask you a few more general questions about the BAU before we start delving into some Delphi specifics. But I'm curious, what does a day in the life of a BAU FBI agent look like? I'm sure it's probably pretty different day by day, but if you can kind of break down the kind of work that somebody in that position would be doing, that would be awesome.
Sure. And I can speak to my job and my role. I think it's similar throughout the BAUs. You're just maybe focused on a different violation and a different victim, in a different offender, a different type of offender. But, unlike being, out in the field and being a regular agent, call them regular agents, it's not as active. You're not out interviewing people. You're not out doing surveillance. It's really a desk job for the most part. You're looking over cases, you're reviewing files, you're reviewing other people's work, basically, because we're consultants. And, occasionally there will be travel involved where you will go see the scene of the crime. And certainly in major crimes or crimes where you really can't get a sense of the crime scene from photographs, you would travel and meet. In any high profile case, BAU agents would travel to the scenes to meet in person, not only with the investigators, but sometimes the prosecutors. We travel to the crime scene and get all of our questions answered about the case while we're there. So that's basically what it is, like sitting there looking at files, writing reports, and sometimes traveling. It is not nearly as I guess tactical as you are as when you're still in a field office.
I was wondering, I mean, it must be highly competitive though to join the BAU within the FBI, because I think that's a lot of people's, kind of perception of what the FBI does is essentially track down unidentified killers, serial killers, things like that. So, I mean, is that how it's perceived within the Bureau?
It is competitive to get into the BAU. I mean, I believe, I'm sure I'm not going to be exactly right, but there are 12,000 agents and there's not too many positions. Depending on the unit, there's anywhere between maybe 5 and 12 agents per unit. So it's not that big, and it does tend to be pretty competitive. So if a job opens, like if someone retires or leaves or transfers and a job opens, you might have anywhere from 20 to 30 agents applying for one position there. And I think what makes it not quite as competitive as people might think is that you have to move. You have to live there. You can't, if you're in an office, let's say in Boston, you'd have to move to Virginia and work down in the Virginia area, which is where the office is. So some people don't apply just because they get settled in where they are and they don't want to have to move. But yeah, it is pretty competitive. And when I joined the FBI, while I really wanted to be a profiler, I thought someday I would love to do that. I also joined knowing that I might never get that opportunity. So I needed to love what I was doing anyway, and I did. And I think even if I hadn't been selected, I was very happy with what I was doing and really happy with the office I was in, the squad I was on. And so you can't join the FBI thinking that, you're just going to walk right into the position. But also, if you don't give up and you kind of, are willing to maybe sacrifice a few things and persevere, you still have a chance. And when I was in school, in graduate school, we had an FBI agent come talk to one of our classes, and one of the students had asked, what are the chances of becoming an FBI profiler? And this is all around the time where the Silence of the Lambs had come out, and so that was a big draw. People wanted to become FBI profilers, and they thought they could do that right from the FBI Academy. But one of the students had asked, what are the chances of becoming a profiler if you get into the FBI? And I remember the guy went 0. And I said, well, that's impossible. That's not 0. Come on. So, I mean, he was not very encouraging about it. Let's put it that way. He said, don't join the FBI if that's what you want to do. You're not, that's just a myth, and you're not going to go in there right in the academy. He was just really, really mad about the question. But I remember that really well. That stuck in my head. But I understood what he was saying. It's like, you may never get a chance because, there's so many people that join the FBI that, one person told me, being a FBI profiler is a dream job within a dream job. Yeah. So, and I thought that was a pretty good description.
What is the process like of preparing a profile? Like, what are you looking for?
So I think every case is different, but and it depends on what is being asked of you. So, for example, somebody might just want an interview strategy. They might want a personality assessment. They might want a prosecution strategy, a media strategy. So there's all different types of linkage analysis. You might have multiple crimes and they want to know if they're connected. They may not have forensic evidence, but are they connected behaviorally? And then kind of the bread and butter of the BA uses an unknown offender profile. And generally that's what the crimes against adults and the crimes against children's unit tend to do, because they tend to work more of the homicides than the other units. In fact, the majority of the homicides fall within those two units. So profile of an unknown offender. And I think everybody has a different way of approaching an analysis. For me, if it's a traditional homicide or if it's a serial murder case, I really rely heavily on crime scene photographs, autopsies, lab results. Those are what I tend to focus on the most. And I try to piece back together as best I can the sequence of events of the crime. What was the interaction between the offender or offenders and victim or victims? As best you can, what happened here? And, that is my background, my specialty, being a forensic scientist and having worked a lot of crime scenes. I think that I'm pretty good at that. So that's why I look at it that way. Somebody else might have a different process, but we do rely heavily on, autopsy reports, the crime scene photographs, visiting the crime scene, getting an idea of exactly where the crime occurred. Is it a busy area, high traffic area? Is it remote? Who has access to it? Who would know how to get there? Those types of questions. So it's really, I always like to travel. Sometimes it wouldn't be necessary. I mean, we were extremely busy. You just didn't have enough time to travel on every case. So if you had a single homicide in a house and you had a pretty good idea, maybe you've even been to that location, the city before, you may not necessarily need to travel. Another really important part of coming up with a profile is victimology and learning everything that you can about that specific victim. And what I found when cases had been brought to us is that was what was lacking the most in investigations, like this thorough understanding of the victim. And I think that it can be hard to ask certain questions because you don't want to sound like you're blaming the victim. And there certainly is a way to gently approach those types of questions. But there's a lot of sensitive, things you need to ask about those victims, because what we're trying to determine is their risk level and what made them, a victim at that particular time for that particular offender, and where in their lives did they have risk, if any. And so that's really important. It's really to have a good understanding of the victim. So that's another thing I really would focus on. And what we do, we have these questionnaires called general assessment questionnaires, and they're pages of questions that focus on kind of different aspects or different areas of a person's life. And they can be used not only for a victim, they could be used for an offender, trying to get, a personality assessment of an offender if you want to try to interview that offender or have a better understanding of that offender. They can be used for interview strategies and things like that as well. So they're very helpful, but they ask questions and they're kind of broken up into different areas of the person's life. And so what you want to do as an investigator is provide those questionnaires to different people that knew that particular victim in different capacities, whether it was a friend, a family member, a coworker, because everybody may present differently depending on the situation they are, depending on the person they're interacting with. So you may pick up tidbits of information from somebody who may not even know a victim very well, but there might be something that they noticed at one point and they can answer a question. And sometimes we've gotten questionnaires back and they just a few questions are answered, but they can still be very valuable. So that's how we would build on victimology. And almost every single case that we would work on, and I say we because we always do this as a team. Not one person can't do a profile. You can try, but it really is good to have somebody check you and make sure you're not getting tunnel vision. And but yeah, almost every single time a case would come in, we'd send out a questionnaire saying, can you go get more victimology? And And I just think typically that tends to be lacking in an investigation. So that's how you would start. And then in terms of, trying to like report it out, and I'll kind of focus on maybe an unknown offender profile, like characteristics of an offender that you're looking for. And so then you talk about, okay, what's the summary of the case, what occurred, list out any autopsy results, and area demographics might come into play. What's the crime problem in the particular area? And then we don't really call it a profile. It's like a criminal investigative analysis. But a lot of times I would just say, here's my assessment. Here are my observations. And the observations might not necessarily be part of a profile where you're talking about characteristics. You're talking about, laying out what you think happened between the offender and the victim. Like, okay, this is what we think happened. And then and impressions of that, and what does that mean? And then maybe go into, personality traits and characteristics of the offender. And that's kind of how it works. I mean, I feel like you're kind of starting over every time you get a case in. There's just no one way to do thing. Every case is different. And then, anyway, that's generally how you do it. I've given an overview, but there's always the situations where, okay, we're going to do things a little differently because the case, requires that this be approached in a different way.
Here at the Murder Sheet, we work on the podcast and our investigative reporting full time. That means we sometimes don't have time to meticulously plan and cook delicious and nutritious meals. So, in this new year, we are eternally grateful to our sponsor, Factor.
Now's a great time to try out ready-to-eat meal delivery service Factor. Remember, when you support our great sponsors like Factor, you're supporting us and our ability to keep doing this work. So please consider visiting factormeals.com/msheet50 and use code msheet50 to get 50% off.
Factor allows you to pop your ready-made meal into the microwave. In 2 minutes flat, you'll have a hot and ready dish with minimal cleanup afterward. It's just that simple.
Also, this food is awesome. I recently dug their black bean and rice enchilada bowl with roasted zucchini, corn, and salsa verde. It tasted so fresh and flavorful.
I love that we get to skip meal prep, the grocery stores, expensive to-go orders, and elaborate cleanup. Plus, there's plenty of options for extra picky eaters like me.
We've really been thrilled with Factor, and we feel you will be too if you're striving to eat healthy and save time in 2024. It's really helped me meet my nutritional goals for the new year.
Head to factormeals.com/msheet50 and use code msheet50 to get 50% off. That's code msheet50 at factormeals.com/msheet50 to get 50% off.
Absolutely. I was curious in terms of how a case even gets on BAU's desk. Can you talk about that process?
Sure. So the request, it's a myth. The FBI doesn't just come in and take over. Maybe some people have had that experience, but we are invited into an investigation. So there has to be a formal request from the requesting agency, which would be state, local, or federal. And that request would come to the BAU, and then usually like the boss of that unit chief would make a determination. Does this meet the criteria of a case that we would work on? And most of them do. Some cases are maybe not suitable for profile in certain situations, but that would be made at the unit chief level. Every field office has what's called an NCAVC coordinator, which is the local liaison between the local agencies, the state and local agencies within their territory, and the BAUs. So every field office will have an NCAVC coordinator. Some field offices, depending on the size, may have multiple. And, their job, it's an extracurricular duty within an office. And so they're all assigned different. So I was a coordinator at one point in Boston, and I was still assigned to public corruption, but my job was if a local police department had a case and reached out to the FBI looking for a profile, it would be my job to gather the materials, get them together, send them down to the BAU. So occasionally we would get at BAU, we would get calls directly. And if we get a call directly, we wouldn't necessarily refer them back to the NCABC coordinator, but we would certainly communicate and loop in the NCABC coordinator in those communications and bring them into it and sort of put them in the middle, because BAUs are part of the headquarter division. So what we don't want to do is be doing work in a territory and that local field office has no idea. I mean, there may be very rare occasions, like really top secret investigations that nobody can know about, that they don't tell the local field office. But in a case is like a homicide or a serial murder case or, a high profile case, we would absolutely let the local office know that we're involved, and that local NCABC coordinator is welcome to be a part as much as they want to be. If they want to come to any consultations, if they want to visit the crime scene, they become part of it. And some are, I guess, more motivated to be part of that process, and some are not as motivated to be part of it, or they're just busy. They might be in trial and they just can't. But what we really want to do is bring them in because they have the relationships, often, really good relationships. Hopefully, I should say, hopefully they're good relationships. Sometimes, beyond our control, they're not always great, but they should theoretically have good relationships with the state and locals. So we want them involved. So that's typically how it would work. And I can't really think of a case where the BAU, unless it was like some national security case that you couldn't tell anybody about, why you wouldn't involve the local NCABC coordinator in the local office in that process. That's really important. And, if you're doing work in a territory somewhere and then they find out, I mean, that's not going to be appreciated.
What? That sounds like it would cause some drama.
Absolutely. Yeah. Feathers get ruffled very easily in law enforcement. People can be very territorial. And I understand that. I would be, if I was, as a agent in Boston, if I found out that BAU was coming up and talking to people that I already have established relationships with, and I'm not aware of that, yeah, I would be a little bit perturbed by that. I think I would say, what, these are the relationships that I have to maintain full time, and I should be involved in that. And I believe in that, and that's what we always try to do at BAU, is make sure the local agents are involved.
That makes a lot of sense. In the Richard Allen case, the original defense attorneys, of course, filed a Franks memorandum where they assert that the BAU came into the case, and they actually indicate that, in their view, the BAU actually made a definite conclusion that someone involved with Odinism was involved with the murders. And just in your experience, is it typical for the BAU, or would you expect the BAU to make such definite, strong conclusions about a crime?
Typically. So I am aware of what was said in the Franks motion, and obviously my attention was drawn immediately when I saw BAU was involved in that, and that is a strong statement. It is just knowing how careful we are when we put things in writing and when we do an analysis. There's a lot of caveats. And in fact, at the beginning of our report, there's this whole paragraph of caveats. It's all based on probabilities. And this could change at any point in time if additional information is developed. It's just heavily caveated. So that's very strong language. Now, that tells me like one of two things. It's just, I mean, it's one of two things. Maybe it's something else as well if I think through it enough. But, either there's something present. And so what I want to make clear, I have not seen crime scene photographs. I have not seen autopsy results. I've never worked on this investigation, so I cannot speak to this in particular. I've only seen media reports, and I will say you cannot do any kind of profile off media reports whatsoever. So you just can't, it's impossible. So that's why I want to just make that very clear that I'm not speaking about this case. But so it tells me that there was something, that BAU saw that made them believe that this was definitive. So, and they did use that strong language, and that's possible sometimes. There's sometimes you write something because you are so certain about it because there's just no other possibility. It just has to be. Or that's an interpretation of, that maybe the written report says likely involved or familiar with, or, maybe there's some language in there. And then the interpretation was, oh, they said they had the beliefs. And that happens all the time. And I'll give a perfect example. It's not related to this case at all, but there were some threatening letters at one point being sent. This is actually prior to me being in the BAU. I was a coordinator at the time. And there were some threatening letters, and the author was using language and had written the letters to, sound like that the person was perhaps African American, uneducated African American. And it was written like that. And BAU, during the consultation, told the investigators that this is somebody who is using that language to try to not pretend. I don't even think they used the word, but they were using that language, which could be considered a contraindicator, which means they're trying to potentially be somebody that they're not. And then the investigator testified that the BAU said it was a Black man who wrote the threatening letter. And a judge said, I find that hard to believe. And of course, at that point, it blew up. And so there can be misinterpretations of what BAU says. Sometimes people hear what they want to think, or it's confirmation bias. They think they have a suspect, and the BAU says, oh, it likely could be this, or there just could be some misinterpretation of that. And there is a lot of confirmation, but you hear it sometimes what you want to hear. We all do that. We can't help it. We have a vision in our head, and we only want to see and read and consume things that validate what we think. So that this is what happened. And luckily there was a written report that was, had all the caveats in there that this is likely a contraindicator, somebody pretending that they're an uneducated Black male. So that's how things can get misinterpreted. Occasionally, there are times where an investigator will call directly to the unit, and they'll have a conversation. There won't be any kind of official analysis of the case. And it could just be that the agent at BAU says, oh yeah, it does sound like this. And there's no further follow-up, and there's not a formal analysis. These kinds of informal conversations happen all the time. I don't know if that happened here, but it could have. But it happens all the time. They brief you, hey, this is what we've got. What do you think? Well, I think this could be this. I think this could be that. But you would always tell them, but this is just off the top of my head without seeing anything. We're going to have to do a formal analysis. And anytime I took phone calls like that, I always documented them. We just have little internal memos, like so-and-so call. We discussed these things. This is what I told them. And so I always documented. I don't, I can't say everyone would document those things, but that I would just make an internal memo so that I could refer back to it if I had to, if they called back for requesting official analysis.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting to me that we're actually in the document, we're getting it third hand because it's the Frank's memorandum interpreting a message, a letter from an investigator who worked on the Odinist Angle, Todd Click, who was actually working with two FBI counterterrorism task force members, neither of whom were FBI agents, but state police and local police who belonged to task forces. And then he's interpreting the BAU's words. So yeah, it definitely stood out to us as like, this seems very strongly worded, but certainly interesting.
It is strongly worded, and that may be the way it's worded, or it could be in the interpretation. But if there was a formal analysis, there will be a report, and that report will be very thorough. It will have, like I said, it will start off with all the caveats. It will list, and of course, this is how we wrote our report. This is how I was taught, and this is how we were doing it at the time. Maybe it's all changed since I've retired, but it's very thorough. And you would list out the date you were contacted for assistance, who contacted you, what agency contacted you. You'd list out any times you had a meeting. This goes into every final report. And who was present at those meetings. And now occasionally, if you have a huge group of people like a task force, you may not list out every single person. But generally, consultations, they might be, have, at least 2 agents from BAU, and you might have a number of investigators. And so you would list those out. Then you would describe do a case summary and write out and describe what the crime is, what happened, sort of the circumstances surrounding the commission of that crime. And this is all based on what law enforcement is telling you, and what you've observed through crime scene photos and things like that. So just a case summary. And then, like I said, section on, autopsy, if pertinent, if there, if this is a homicide. Any lab results that have come back, you list those out, because you want to make sure that in your report, you're writing out everything that you've considered as part of your analysis. So investigators know, these are all the things I considered because this is what I was given to consider in this analysis. And then, after that, then there's the analysis. And so it's really important if you make, let's say, a prediction of something, you describe why are you making that prediction, and be very specific about it. You kind of have to back up your analysis. So if there is this determination or prediction that this person, what was the terminology, or they practiced Nordic beliefs, or is that the
let me pull up the exact wording. It was that according to the summary of Click's investigation that he attached with his letter, the Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, of the FBI determined that the individuals responsible for the homicides were involved in Nordic beliefs.
Right. So list out why that the determination or the assessment is that they were involved. And it has to be very specific. What makes them think that? And that would be huge in this particular case. And how do you know they're involved as opposed to potentially staging, or what's the difference? For example, a lot of times you can tell like a burglary is staged. So how do you know this wasn't a real burglary? Or how do you know that they're just not, Googling something and finding, okay, what would a scene look like if an Odinist did it, So, but specifically, why do you think they are? And then also, if familiarity doesn't mean that they necessarily practice it, or they may be familiar with it through media. They may be familiar with it through just reading something or seeing something on TV. And so, again, I think that it's important to try to establish, how do you know that they, are actually practicing it, as opposed to just having a familiarity with it in staging. Yeah. It's strongly worded. There, I would think there has to be something that really stands out. If that's the words that were used by BAU, there has to be something that made them think that, if it's in fact what they said.
Right. Right. So many ifs at this point, right?
And we just don't know for sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that they're lying. I think this is what they think. They think that this is what BAU said, maybe, and but did they actually say that? I don't know. And also, there's all a difference in from some of the media that I've seen. Some have interpreted that statement as, okay, this was, a ritual killing of some sort. And, that doesn't, I don't take from that statement necessarily that this was any kind of sacrifice. It may be, that may be what they're saying. But it also could be, this is not going to motive. This is just going to characteristics of this particular offender. The motive could be something else. But I think some people were interpreting it, the motive is a ritualistic sacrifice based on that sentence. So that's another thing to consider, is that, maybe this person has these characteristics, has this familiarity, has this knowledge, but it doesn't mean that was the reason for the murders. That's another question I think is out there.
That's really well said. And yes, a lot of people did see this as the FBI endorsing a ritual murder theory.
Yeah. When I read it at first too, well, I don't think I didn't read the Frank's motion. I read the headline and I thought, what? Because that's unusual. That would be extremely unusual. We don't see, I mean, I never worked a ritualistic killing. So it's so rare. It is so rare. And so I was surprised when I kind of saw, this is ritualistic. And through rumors, I had heard there was, some strange things that had, strange behavior exhibited at the crime scene and some unusual things. But it didn't occur to me, this is a sacrifice of some sort. I just thought this could be staging. It could be ritualistic behavior on the part of the offender, in that this is something that, it's something extra, like the MO, what you need to do to commit the crime and get it done. That's your MO. And then anything that's extra is kind of ritualistic behavior. So I was saying this could be ritualistic behavior in that sense, as opposed to like a ritualistic sacrifice. But once I read the Frank's motion, I saw the sentence. I'm like, okay, I don't think that necessarily indicates that that was the motive. It just goes more to the characteristics of the offender.
It's a really, really good point. And one thing I know our listeners are probably going to be like, why are they not asking Julia to profile the Delphi case?
Right.
And they're probably screaming at us right now, asking, well, what's her profile of this killer? But I loved what you said earlier about you can't profile based on limited information, including media reports. And of course, a lot of what we have at this point from the case is a Frank's memorandum that goes into detail on the crime scene, but is not the same thing as having the case file in front of you. And I'm wondering, can you talk about that and why it would be sort of irresponsible for people to kind of be profiling based on limited information and anything other than, conversations with investigators and a case file to look at?
Sure. You cannot profile a case based on media reports without seeing, and I don't need to see, a profiler doesn't need to see every single investigative interview. That's not necessary in every single case. But without seeing an autopsy, without seeing crime scene photos, without having thorough victimology done, you just can't create a profile. And I have seen even really high profile cases, like my own case, which was one of them. Prior to his arrest, Joe D'Angelo, there had been shows done on him, And I once saw an interview that had been done with another retired FBI profiler, and they were profiling this particular killer, the person responsible for these, and it was not him. It was wrong. And that just goes to show you that they were just taking based off media reports. And the thing about that particular case is that without seeing the details of the incident reports and the reports from the victims that the survivors of those, you really didn't have an idea of what truly happened between the victim and that particular offender until you actually read every single thing. It was really important. So people were interpreting this guy as this like tough, brazen, he's going to want to boast and brag about his crimes. And that's not what we saw in the investigation when we really looked at all the details of every single file. And we reviewed, I was the lead, so I reviewed everything. So it was probably like 15,000 pages or so. I think that was an estimate, and a very different person emerged than what had been portrayed by the media. And so then Joe D'Angelo is identified through forensic genetic genealogy and brought into court. And lots of people were surprised. Look at him. He's faking, because the day before he was out on his motorcycle. He was perfectly fine. He's very healthy man in his 70s. My colleague on that case who helped me with it, we were not surprised at all by him. It's exactly what we expected because we saw this behavior of his when he was committing his crimes, when he was losing control of during the commission of his crimes. When he started to lose control and the victims got the upper hand in any way, shape, or form, he imploded. He had trouble handling that, and he displayed certain characteristics. Doesn't mean he wasn't dangerous, but he's extremely dangerous. And he would often, if he could, he would go, the minute he started to lose control, he would escalate directly to deadly force. But prior to getting to be able to maintain control in situations where he couldn't escalate directly to deadly force, he was exhibiting certain behaviors that indicated to us that he is, insecure. He can't handle things very well. He can't handle stress well. So when he was arrested, this was the ultimate. All his control was taken away and he completely imploded. And this is what we saw. And we thought we were looking at the truest version of Joe D'Angelo when he came into court that first day. That's Joe D'Angelo. That was really, truly him. So that's why I always go back to even a very high profile case like that, where everybody thinks they have a lot of information about it. You can't do it. You can make assumptions, you can speculate, but to really do it with any kind of accuracy, you really do need to see certain parts of the investigation. And I'm not saying you have to see every single piece, but certainly certain parts. And in Delphi, at the very least, you would have to have reviewed the autopsy results. And when I say review, you study them. You study them really close and you understand every single injury done. What was an injury that could have caused death? What was not? Was there anything gratuitous? Were there defense wounds? Like, you study it and you understand it. You look at every single photo that's taken during the autopsy. You look at the crime scene photographs. You try to determine exactly what happened. And hopefully by the time you're looking, and it's not always the case, but you're able to determine, okay, if there's, blood spatter somewhere, whose blood is it? And is it a combination? Did the offender hurt themselves? You trying to determine, was the lab able in any way, shape, or form to link any evidence that was found at the scene to the offender or to an offender, or do they believe in any way that it was from the offender or left by the offender? So there's just so much that goes into it that there's just no way you can do a profile without knowing all these things. I mean, at the very least, I mean, you can say, okay, you have two little girls what could they do to have someone do this to them? So you go, so this offender has to be like a psychopath. So, I mean, that's the best you could do. Like, this person doesn't care about human life. I mean, that's about as much as you can say about the offender. And of course, with some evidence that was released, you might be able to say white male, but any more than that, there's just not much more you can go on without seeing it. So I know, I mean, it's really tough because people want answers. They want to know, what's the profile? Who is this? I mean, it's such a horrific and significant case, and not only for this area, but it's gripped the country, and the world, really. I mean, you cannot imagine who would do something like that. And people want answers. They want to know, they want to understand, how did this happen? Who could do something like this? And so it's very unsatisfying when you say, we really can't tell you at this point. The investigators know. I mean, they have seen all this. So, and they're the only ones that really have that information. And typically, I mean, this is not a fast breaking case anymore, but it's still, in a, very active phase. And so to comment any more on that too, I think in my role, in my former position, would be irresponsible as well.
Well, we so appreciate you because unfortunately, a lot of people just don't do that. And I think it's problematic. I think it muddies the waters and takes away from the real value that profiling can have as far as being an investigative tool and a way to figure things out. And it's as you said, it's trying to give answers to a worried public, which is totally understandable. But it's not really giving answers. It's just sometimes turns into kind of a speculative sludge rather than a profile of value.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of two camps when it comes to profiling. People think that it's just complete junk science. It's not useful at all. And you shouldn't trust anything. And there's others that think it's magic, that it's a psychic of some sort. It's the be all end all. In this case, you do kind of see that a lot of people had jumped on, oh, the BAU said this. And so it must be true. And I will say the BAU, and I'm going to include myself, they can be wrong. That you are just not always accurate on a profile. There was a study done, which I really appreciated. It was done by a professor at a university in Texas, and what he had done, I just came across this randomly, but it wasn't done too long ago. And what he had done is he had reviewed all 9 profiles that had been done of the Golden State Killer over the course of the investigation, and was making kind of a determination. It wasn't like a competition about which was the best or anything like that, although I did call him and ask him. So I need to talk. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, but I mean, joking aside, he went through, and it wasn't just about like what was accurate, and it was difficult because some of it's comparing apples and oranges, because not everybody had the same predictions in terms of what they were predicting. So he was looking at what the predictions were and what was accurate, what was inaccurate, what was indeterminate, and then was there anything useful by it? Was it, does it provide any use, any investigative use to the agencies that had requested these profiles? And the most accurate was like 75%, and And I think in his study he talks about looking at some profiles done in the UK, and the most accurate is like 72%. There's always something you're going to be wrong, particularly if you're trying to be extremely thorough and you're making, you're trying to answer certain questions. I always go into a case thinking, this is what they're asking me for, but what do I also think needs to be answered? So like, do I need to link other cases? Do I need to try to determine if there's more than one offender? Because people think sometimes there's two offenders. I mean, I try to figure out, I really want to provide something of use and answer some questions for them. But it just goes to show that we're not always right. And we don't, I don't expect to be right. I want to be right. And even when I have been wrong in my analysis, and I will say most of the time, the analysis, that I've seen and the resulting, like once the offender's arrested and identified, and the profiles are usually fairly accurate, but there's always a miss somewhere. And you always have I don't want to call it an excuse, but you have a reason why that was, maybe why you were not accurate. For example, I keep going back to the Golden State Killer because this study was done, but one of the things, and I kind of knew anecdotally just by talking to investigators and knowing who Joe D'Angelo was, I knew what I got wrong, and it was about the military. And based on his crimes, the crimes that were presented to me as potential crimes committed by this offender, my thought was he was younger than he was. And one of the many investigators thought that perhaps he was moving around California because he was in the military and he was moving to be closer to military bases. And, there was some backing to this because during his crimes, he made a lot of references to being in the military, and he dressed in a very military way when some of the victims described him and his clothing and stuff. And he was also very tactical at what he did and very good at what he did and very proficient. So I thought one of the questions I needed to answer was he in the military? Because I thought he was too young. What I didn't know was that there was a whole series of burglaries that happened even before the ones that I was given. And so he started earlier. So I think I would have had a better age range. So I thought he was just too young to have been in the military. And it turned out that, he was older than I thought. He had been in the military at one point in time, several years prior to the offenses that I analyzed. And he was not in the military at the time of the offense. And another reason why I didn't think he'd be in the military, not only because of his age, was because he took such great steps to protect his identity. And I didn't think that he would provide a detail of his life that could potentially lead to identifying him. Because if he had been in the military, they would be able to go check the bases and cross-reference names. And of course, he wasn't in the military at the time. So that was the area where I was inaccurate. And I understand why I was. So not an excuse, but certainly that's why that part was inaccurate. Now, what turned out to be extremely useful for the investigation was that I linked a series of burglaries to the entire series of rapes and murders. And those burglaries provided another data point for the genetic genealogy that they were doing. And investigators reported that, they would have got there eventually, but that extra kind of knowledge of having those crimes got them, to his identity a lot faster. So my report was actually operationally useful. So I was surprised because sometimes it's not. Sometimes they're just very interesting and like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. We have a really good understanding of the offender and of the crime, but it didn't necessarily provide anything of use in terms of, solving the crimes. And that's another thing I'll say is profiling does not solve crimes. It does not identify offenders. It may help prioritize offenders. It may give you a better understanding. It may provide you information to conduct a well-informed interview of an offender, but we don't identify offenders.
So important to note. You can't just go into a courtroom and say, we profiled him, and everyone's like, all right.
Yeah. And yeah, it's kind of how it works on TV. But yeah, everybody wants to hear the profile. And I always feel like people are disappointed. You know, we have a podcast I do with 3 other retired profilers, and I know people are always hoping like just tell us who did it. Like, I think on the unsolved ones, and I'm like, we just can't. And you know, personally, we may all think, yeah, we know who did it, or we feel, you know, but I've seen so many times where even we create a profile, and this happened in a case that I did in Oklahoma, Walika, Oklahoma, which in some ways was very similar to Delphi, just on the surface. It was 2 girls, ages 11 and 13, and they were shot and killed on a rural road in Oklahoma in Walika on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. There no sexual assault or anything like that. In terms of, it is not similar to Delphi. What's similar is kind of it's a small area. It's out in the rural area, and the ages of the victims, and the fact that there were 2 of them. So that was kind of a similarity. When I did the profile for the case in Oklahoma, there was an individual in terms of personality traits and characteristics, and some information about the location of where this person lived in relation to the crime scene. And that was all part of my profile. It seemed like this guy could be the offender. It really did. I personally thought, I bet this guy did it. But I didn't say that because I said, he's got to be prioritized until you can rule him out. But I also realized that profile could match somebody else. And sure enough, they did identify somebody a few months later, and it was somebody else. And he was very similar to this other person in every way, but it wasn't him. And so that's why, you have to be really careful. You just can't identify. You can't say this person did it. And so I always think, I know the person, I know the offender has these personality traits and characteristics based on what I've seen. But I also know that maybe more than one person will fit these personality traits and characteristics. And it's really the investigation that's going to solve the crime. It's going to be, interviews, forensic evidence, timelines, witnesses, all of that. That's what's really going to solve it. So
I think that's so well said and responsible that you, and we're going to plug your podcast at the end, because I really want people to listen, because I think this is the real deal of profiling and how it is a valuable help to investigations, and should not be just seen as like a media thing. I do want to ask you, because I know people are fascinated with this. Can you talk us through your involvement with the Golden State Killer case, how you came on board, the kind of work you were doing, and then like take us up till D'Angelo's arrest?
Sure. So, well, I'm going to take you back to 2004. So I was on maternity leave with my son, and I was watching a documentary on A&E in the middle of the day, and I saw a show on what was the East Area Rapist Original Night Stalker, which was the moniker used for this offender back then. And the show was discussing not only his crimes, but the fact that they had the serial rapes that occurred in Sacramento had been linked to homicides that had occurred in the southern part of the state through DNA, and that had been done in 2001. And on that show, Detective Larry Poole, he's with the Orange County Sheriff's Department, and he had a case within his jurisdiction. The Golden State Killer, he was in like 15 different jurisdictions, so it covered the whole span of the state. And he was interviewed, and I became very fascinated with the case and read everything that I could online. And then fast forward to, I think, 2011, And my boss called me into the office and said, have you ever heard of the East Area? And by this time, he had not been given the moniker Golden State Killer. We didn't know about that until Michelle McNamara's book came out. And she had dubbed him that in an article she had written for LA Magazine. So he was called the Golden State Killer several years later. So, but he said, have you ever heard of the East Area Rapist? And I said, yes, I have. I'll take it. I knew what case it was immediately. And I couldn't believe, I'm like, how do you not know what this is? And it's strange how much that case flew under the radar. It really wasn't until Michelle McNamara's book that really shined a spotlight on how prolific this offender was. I don't think people quite understood, unless they were, kind of true crime nerds or within law enforcement. They didn't even realize this offender was out there, or that these crimes were all connected. So I took the case, and then, similar to what I described earlier in this interview, I started just reading through every single incident report. I started with the sexual assaults in Sacramento, reading through all of them. And then, of course, the homicides. And then a big part of that was linking the burglaries that had occurred prior to the serial rapes, that they occurred in Visalia, California, which is about 4 hours from Sacramento. So, I just reviewed that. And then I went out to a task force meeting, and what they had done, and the reason why they had come to the FBI, is they had decided, all the jurisdictions decided to get together and form a working group and share all their information, because there wasn't a lot of communication between the different jurisdictions. So the NCABC's VICAP unit created like an online portal where all the investigators could review every single report, and they uploaded it all in there. And I don't know if every investigator reviewed every single thing, but some of them did. I certainly did. But I went out there, and we all went around the room and introduced ourselves, and they got to Larry Poole, who I had seen so many years earlier on A&E. And he introduced himself, and I felt kind of intimidated. And I mean, not intimidated, because I don't think I really get intimidated, but I felt pressure. Like, this detective has been on this case all these years. He's was the longest serving detective at that time on the case, and continued to be until it was solved. And I just felt pressure, and I just realized how much it meant, not only to him, but to the other detectives that had been on the cases so long. But he introduced himself, and he looked over at me, and he said, I'll be very interested to see what the FBI has to say. That's if they'll tell me what they think. That's if they'll share their opinion with me. And, just kind of looking at me, I thought, oh no, I don't think he's had a good experience, or he has a perception of the FBI. And I just remember when I introduced myself, and I looked over at Larry, and I said, I'll tell you what I think. I'm not afraid to tell you what I think. And so I ended up giving a very preliminary profile that day. And he'd come up to me, and I really felt like he embraced it. There were many investigators that, and this happens a lot, that just didn't think that that this was this offender, that the characteristics that I was starting to develop was this offender. And so that was kind of my first introduction. And then went back, and my partner, I mean, there are several people in the unit that worked on this with me, and we kind of started to formulate a profile. But my close partner on this, Bob Drew, he and I ended up going back out to the working group meeting. I think it was probably like another 6 months later. I don't remember the time frame, but we ultimately delivered kind of our final profile on the case verbally. And then, of course, like I said, we followed up with a very thorough written report that went out to like all the agencies, so that they could have that. And, I don't know, I think some of them read it and digested it, and others probably just never saw it, or just threw it in a file somewhere. It just, some people, really like the behavior part of it and find that fascinating, and others just don't. And they're really focused on the investigative part of it or the forensics part of it. But other people just really, and certainly there were certain people, particularly Detective Poole, who really embraced the profile. And I think, felt like he had a really good understanding of who the offender was after that. So that was kind of my whole process. But I think one of the things that I like to point out about, I say two things about Joe D'Angelo that I found really interesting when I was reviewing the files is that I had gone through the first 15 sexual assault cases from Sacramento. And I realized that he had not committed any sexual assault until after he engaged in significant ransacking of the home prior. So he would enter the homes and spend sometimes several hours in the homes with the victims. He started out with just female victims, and then he started to break into the homes that they had a female and male couple. And so, and that kind of became, a signature of his. But I did realize he wasn't sexually assaulting anybody until he had ransacked the home. And when he ransacked the home, he was very loud about it. Made it very obvious what he was doing. Sometimes he stole things, and some things were not of much value. And so I thought that was really significant. The ransacking was part of his ritual. It was what he needed to do in order to get gratification out of these crimes. That was really important to him. And so when I was looking at the Visalia crimes, which did not have any sexual assault victims, there was a murder in that series of burglaries, but no sexual assaults. But what I was looking at, and these incident reports of these burglaries were very short because they were just considered nuisance. Like the offender was going in the middle of the day when people weren't home. He was ransacking their homes and sometimes, vandalizing some things. And, he'd steal like one earring from a pair. So just some illogical behavior. But there were some things that stood out that I thought, these are sexual burglaries. These are sexually motivated burglaries. And I know some people may think that doesn't really make sense, but there was evidence, that he might be masturbating at these scenes. The East Area rapist always used lotion as a lubricant. It would always be something he would use. And usually it was, belonging to the victim. It was a product that they already had in their home, but he would use that. And there was indications that he was using lotion. There were lotions and fingerprints at one of the scenes. There was, he poured lotion down the hallway on the carpet in another scene. I thought, okay, this offender is, using lotion in some. So I thought perhaps he might even be masturbating. There was a lot of other similarities, these little things, that would jump out, not in every report, but I'd be like, oh, so I think this is related. So I think those are a couple of the things that, really stood out to me about him, that this ransacking was really his ritualistic behavior.
How did it feel when he finally got arrested? I mean, that must have been like a big moment.
So I, kind of another myth about FBI is that like we're there, we're, arresting and we're doing the interviews. And, I knew something. I mean, just, once you do the profile, if you have a very active investigation, you may be providing analysis consistently. Like they're calling you all the time. And I did talk to a few of the detectives, like they might get a suspect and they're like, what do you think of this guy? And I'd be like, does he have burglary in his history? No. But they'd run some things by me, but yeah, this wasn't like such an active investigation that we had constant communication. So I wasn't really up to speed on like all the investigative things, but I did notice I knew something was going on. But I wasn't part of the arrest or anything. And I actually found out on Twitter
with everybody else.
Yeah. Well, who is Patton Oswalt.
Yeah.
I saw a tweet from him. Well, actually, my husband saw the tweet from Patton, and I follow him too. And he sent it to me, and I just had this feeling, this is true. This has to be true. They arrested him, and I knew that there was activity going on in the case, but because I'm not a part of the investigation. I was a consultant, and so I'm not privy to that information, and I know they were keeping it very quiet. So I knew, like, I know he's a comedian, and how would he know anything? But I'm this is right. And so then, I went into work, and I had, I didn't want to bother any detectives. Like I knew they were in the middle of, like, so it wasn't my job. So I asked our media coordinator to call the media coordinator out in Sacramento and find out. And so we confirmed it that way. And then eventually, after attempts to interview him, I talked to a couple detectives after that. And so I got the whole scoop on everything. And I think, my first reaction was, I don't know, there's certainly a sense of exhilaration. And then I immediately went to, what must it be like for the survivors? I just can't imagine what that feeling is like, to have an answer, or the survivors, or the victims' families. And then of course, I guess selfishly, I'm like, well, is my profile right? I waited a couple weeks to call anybody and start asking those questions. So, like, can you tell me everything about him? And but that, I really wanted to know. I wanted to know, like, what was accurate and what wasn't. And that information takes a while, because you're trying to determine and get all the background information. And a couple of key things turned out to be accurate. So I was relieved, particularly the linkage of Visalia, because there were several people that were completely against that. And so I called them all. No, I told you, though. No. I did do that, actually. But in good, in my nice way, but,
Yeah, you got it. Well, I mean, maybe they'll kind of see that maybe sometimes things can be linked and shouldn't be dismissed.
Yeah. I was, you can never say things 100%. I never said it 100%. I just said this offender is likely the same offender. These are the reasons why. And I had multiple reasons and multiple examples. And what the problem was, I think the one thing that always gave me pause, and I think what gave a lot of the investigators pause, was the composite sketches, or in the descriptions, didn't match at all. And of course, I kept going back to, well, how the composites are in eyewitness identification is notoriously bad. So I kept going back to that, but then they really were sometimes, the descriptions, quite different. But then I would just go back to the behavior, and I just couldn't get past how similar the behavior was. And so I felt pretty confident it was the same person, and they quickly were able to determine that it was. And so I was relieved about that, because I think that was probably the biggest sticking point and disagreement that I faced. So, which had been a disagreement from the very beginning, so.
This has been amazing, Julia. Like, thank you so much for just sharing your expertise and your time with us. Like, we've really enjoyed talking to you. I guess, I mean, we've kept you already 20 minutes over the hour.
Oh, I didn't even realize. Yeah. I mean, I love what I do. So
you can really tell. And I just, where can people listen to your show? Tell us about the show. Okay. Like, where can people find it?
Yeah. So our show is called The Consult, Real FBI Profilers. And we're on, you can listen to us anywhere. We're not on YouTube yet, but maybe someday. So I do the show. I'm the host, but I do the show with 3 other retired profilers that I worked with when we were in the unit together. And we have mostly talked about cases that we've already profiled. And some of them are solved, a few of them are unsolved, but we're branching out into some cases that we haven't yet profiled. And we're looking at cases where we feel there's enough information to do an accurate profile. Like we have enough information. And we'll continue to do cases that we've already profiled, both solved and unsolved. But we recently covered, and that episode just came out, the first episode, the abduction of Jody Husen-Truitt. And she was a news anchor in Mason City, Iowa, and she was kidnapped as she was coming out of her apartment building, rushing to work on June 27th, 1995, early morning hours. And, there's no autopsy, there's no, body. We have access to crime scene photos. Those are all, it's pretty clear on the pictures that media took, you could see, and plenty of victimology. And so I just found working on that case very meaningful because you have a missing person. And I like the missing person cases. I know that they can be unsatisfying for the listener that really loves to have an answer. But I feel like some of these cases that are so old that remain unsolved, that we just need to, the most important thing is to keep them alive in the news, keep them in the media. At this point, there should be no holdback information. Just put it all out there, everything that we know, keep it alive, because technology advances, relationships change. This offender is not getting any younger. This might be a last time to try to catch this person. And so I just thought, I feel like it was really important and meaningful to cover that case. So, yeah. But unfortunately, we don't have an answer. We do a profile of the unknown offender, however. So, and what we hope is that maybe someone will recognize the characteristics in somebody, and because we do feel like some of the characteristics we described would be recognizable in people that know the offender. And it's quite possible that at the time somebody's not, just knew, I feel like my husband did this, or my brother, or I just feel like he could be responsible, and they, don't come forward, but maybe now after all these years, they will.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just commend you. I mean, the way you guys do this is so responsible, and just really, I love it how it gives people, it's like the real FBI profilers. Like, this is how it works. It's not.
It might not be as exciting as people would like. I think we have, it's like a little niche area that
we're the same way. We try to do investigative journalism in different interviews, and I think sometimes we're just like, well, that's not really how it works, and people are like, oh, but that would be cool, and it's like,
I know.
Well,
I had somebody, a good friend that I do trust, but he said, you need to be more controversial.
No, hold the line, Julie.
No, I know. He's like, and he said, he did also say, you should, because publicly or privately, I will give strong opinions about something. And, I could be wrong, but I have stronger opinions. And this person was like, you need to have the strong opinions. People like that. And I said, yeah, but I feel that that's irresponsible, because sometimes my strong opinions are wrong. And I don't want to mislead anything. I don't want to, and it's not necessary. Like I said, we would have our personal opinions, but professionally, those personal opinions about somebody could be completely wrong. And just keep your mouth shut.
Our listeners, I do think I think there's a growing group in true crime who do appreciate the nuance and do appreciate the kind of toned down, let's be realistic, let's give fact-based analysis rather than the hot takes or the sound bites. And I think there's I think people have gotten that for years, and I think there's a growing contingent of people who feel like maybe that's not super responsible. Maybe we do want something that's more even keeled, and so that your show is for them. So we would strongly people to listen. And is there anything we didn't ask you about before we let you go? I feel like we could talk to you all day about something.
I can't think of anything. I think we've covered. When I've thought about what I was coming on your show for today, I feel like I've covered everything that I thought that I feel that I can cover. So I apologize to your listeners that I cannot tell you who committed this crime. I just, I can't, that's just not what profiling does. So, and not having access to the materials either. So now if we had access to the materials, we could come up with a profile, I think. And it sounds like that might have been done in this case. To what extent, how formal it was, I don't think we know. But if it's formal, there will be a report, and that report it's discoverable. So and it would be disseminated to, from the BAU to the law enforcement agency that requested the assistance.
Absolutely. So maybe we'll see it one day.
Maybe. Yeah. It'll be all blacked out, I'm sure.
Most likely.
I've seen these reports go out that have been requested through FOIA, and like the entire analysis is blacked out. It's all redacted. It's really funny.
Thanks, FBI. Yeah.
All you have the caveat, and then the rest is blacked out. That's pretty much what they look like. Yeah, typical FBI. Oh, and good. Like now that I'm retired, I'm like, darn, I want to see that.
Yeah, but
I know we never will. I mean, if they, FBI profilers rarely testify, and that's just something we don't usually do, and we try to avoid doing just because of the nature of the work. And typically stuff that we've provided to be testified to by detectives, and so we don't testify much. So that's the only time information ever comes out, about what so through testimony.
Right. Hopefully we'll see some of that at this trial. But thank you so much, Julia.
You're welcome.
It was fascinating.
Yeah, this is fascinating.
All right. Yeah, thank you for having me, and best of luck to you and your show as well.
We'd like to thank Julia for taking the time to speak with us and share her insights and experiences.
Again, we highly recommend her own podcast, The Consult, and we will link to it in our show notes. Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.